Hi, Misha here, and we're kind of keeping on with FALs, partially because I'm just in the mood lately, and partially popular demand. And last time, at least going by the plan, I don't know, we talked about my Cuban model. This is a, 1959, 1960 style metric with the wood handguards and the Type B or T48 flash hider. Type 1 receiver, and this has what we call the Type C buttstock. That means it has this metal ferrule, but it is a little more modern than today's subject because it has the plastic pistol grip, plastic handle, and carry handle. Just, that era. This is a really cool gun, and we definitely need to get out and shoot it. But we've talked enough about it. Today, we're going to talk about this guy. A gun that you have seen before on the channel, although I've reworked it a bit. Some new parts. Although there is one part that's not completely correct. And I'm saying at the beginning of the video, kind of challenging you to pick it out. And Seth, you don't count because you already know, so hush. We'll see how long it takes people in the comments to figure it out. But yeah, I've kind of reworked this with the intent of making it look as close as I can, practically speaking, to how these were delivered to the Bundeswehr in 1957, maybe early 1958, when they were adopting the FAL as the Gewehr 1, the G1. But of course, as you know, the G3 is famous there, and we'll get into a little bit of that story because it's always fascinating. And this is a really cool FN variation. And this is actually why later guns, almost exclusively, like the Cuban here, have what we call the short sights. But the story really doesn't begin with the G1 or even the Bundeswehr. It actually goes back to 1949 and the official founding of the Federal German Republic, West Germany as we know it today in history and all that. Because it was founded without a military. Because for some reason, France and Belgium and a few others weren't super keen to rearm the Germans. Can't imagine why. So before you dive into the story, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like to help support us, check out Patreon. With that, let's go back to the era of President Truman and talk about the early days of the Cold War. On 1950, the Allies, they realized that West Germany, we're just going to call it West Germany, does need a federal police force, and the earliest standards for police pistols and all that are established. But they would need something else. But they're not ready, especially France, to allow any kind of actual army. Thus, a little bit of a compromise was hit upon. The Bundesgrenzschutz, the BGS, established March 14, 1951. This was a federal, so all the way, national police agency, intended to be border guards and other just kind of federal level security. It was intended to be lightweight, mobile, and small. In fact, originally it was established with just 10,000 men. But a lot of these men were drawn from the Wehrmacht, from World War II. But ones that were cleared of any charges. You know how that goes. We're not getting into the politics of, Operation Paperclip and all that fun stuff. But so they did have experience, and originally they were just equipped, 52, 53, with World War II era guns. Not just MP44s, as you would imagine, but Carabiner 98s, P38s, and my favorite story, the Spanish Astra Model 600, the P3, where they actually, Spain made them buy it twice. I love that story. I did a video a couple of years ago on it. Check it out. It's fun. So they were just kind of hodgepodging guns. And there was an early attempt at a European North American alliance that didn't go anywhere. So 53, the BGS was expanded to 20,000 men, and you already start to see it growing. Partially, this was in response to East Germany, the DDR or GDR if you prefer, expanding themselves. Again, Cold War politics. Of course, you would have the death of Stalin this year. Khrushchev would come in, but it would take him a couple of years to really establish power. Things are in flux, post-Korean War, all that good stuff. Long story short, by 54, the BGS realizes they need a more modern weapon. And by this time, a new cartridge was coming on the scene, originally known as .30 caliber light rifle. We know it today as 7.62 by 51 NATO, or just 7.62. This would become a de facto standard throughout the world. And so the BGS were looking for a gun to fire it. But it wasn't originally the FAL. I'm holding this for a reason, we'll get there. Originally, it was actually the SETME, at that time known as the Model 02. And that's because the SETME, its roller delayed system, was really developed by Vor Grimler, who at the end of World War II, the Mauser STG 45, all that stuff. So there was that German pedigree. But at that time, the SETME really wasn't up to snuff. It could fire an intermediate cartridge, but not more of a full power cartridge like 7.62 by 51. Now they would eventually go to the Model A SETME, which fired 7.62 by 51 SETME, which is a lighter loaded cartridge. And HK would continue to work with them, 56, 57, to make the Model B. We'll touch back on that later. But I just wanted to mention that the BGS did look at the SETME, but ultimately, in 1955, they bought their first batch of FALs. But these were trials guns, evaluation guns, and there were only 115 of them. Now, we would think of these as Type A's. Of course, they were all made in Belgium by FN. Germany would call them Model A's. They were similar to this, but not identical. In fact, like I said, this is a little bit later gun. They would be wood furniture, either Type A stocks, obviously, and they would have a couple of different handguards, wood either way. They were really considered an improved Canadian model, and they would have a lugged barrel with no built-in flash hider, and they would have the tall sights, which were the standard at the time. Short sights didn't even exist yet. Obviously, they liked them enough that in early 1956, a second batch was ordered. This time, 2,000 guns. And sometimes I've seen these referred to as Model AF. They were transitional. Some would have lugged barrels, some would have a flash hider with the lug behind it, kind of just a leftover. And you would see a couple of different styles of handguards, different styles of buttstocks, again, transitional, still tall sights. And these are the very first ones that they experimented with a bipod with, but it wasn't the style we know and love today. That would come slightly later, in 1956, same year, when a third order for 4,800 was placed by the BGS, not the Bundeswehr. These would be the BGS models that you do know and love. Very, very similar to the Gewehr 1 here, with a couple of exceptions. One, still they have the tall sights, easy way to tell, short sights, closed ear gas block, tall, open ear. Of course, this would be different too. And while they actually had a similar muzzle device, they had the standard right-hand thread Type B, sometimes called the T48. It's keyed on the top, lug on the bottom for a Type B bayonet, whereas of course this is different. And they would be the first ones with these pressed steel handguards and this folding lightweight bipod. So yeah, that third contract to BGS. And these are the ones you think of. When you hear of BGS kits, they're going to have the Type B flash hider, 21-inch barrel, firing 7.62 NATO, 20-round metric mag, Type 1 receiver. By this point, a Type B buttstock, most likely wood pistol grip. Again, very similar to this gun. And that's actually one reason they really dumped the original SETME, was they wanted to be able to fire the new standard cartridge. Makes sense. They're very much a small thing. Now, by this point, the BGS has at least grown to 30,000 men, probably more. But by this point, 1956, we do have the first federal army. Eventually, politicking allowed things in 1954 to let it happen, so moves were being made, and the Bundeswehr was officially established November 12, 1955. And they, of course, would need a gun. Fun fact, nearly half of their original personnel were actually taken from the BGS. So, yeah, and again, a lot of them were former Wehrmacht, especially the officers. But by this point, mid-50s, we do have a younger generation of recruits coming up that were not in World War II. So they looked at what the BGS had, they were familiar with it, and again, they evaluated the SETME. In fact, there were some initial orders placed with Spain for some early SETME models, but they were canceled in 56, and instead, based on the BGS third contract, they would place an order with FN in 1956 for 100,000 Gewehr 1s here. And, well, we have two key differences. First being these sights. The Germans were the first to request the sights be lowered by 3 millimeters. If you look at all your inch patterns and your early metrics, like the Israelis, they're taller. It makes sense. It really does. It gives that little bit lower profile. These are stronger ears, stronger rear sight. It's a tiny change, but it's obviously a good one, because later guns like this one here, placed Cuba in 1958 when it was patterned, delivered in 59, would continue on the short sight. In fact, only a few countries, Argentina comes to mind, would keep on making tall sight guns. It made sense. But of course, by this time, the wood handguard is gone. Mag's still the same, Type 1 receiver. And that was kind of my goal here with this gun, was to put it back to how these would have been delivered in 1957. And 100,000 were ordered. They were pretty much all made in one big production batch at FN and delivered very close together. So there's actually not a lot of variation in G1s as initially shipped. But before we get into that, let's talk about the one other major change from the BGS FAL to the G1 for the Bundeswehr. The other difference, of course, I'm talking about the barrel, the muzzle specifically. Still has the 21-inch barrel. By the way, back then, no FAL barrel was chrome lined. Eventually they'd do chrome chambers. Whew, yeah, I can smell that tire. They went to an interesting system. Based on kind of the standard lugged barrel like you see on Israeli guns, they went to a QD system, which makes a lot of sense. The idea was kind of a multi-purpose device. You would just, and it is that easy, and I definitely never forget how to do it. So right here you have a flash hider. It does actually have a bayonet lug of sorts on the bottom, but it was never used. It was just kind of there. So the idea was to be able to put on different devices. For example, for training, we have this jobber here. Just a blank fire deal. Get her on, and you just snap it on. Again, for blank ammo, that kind of thing. Or if you need to use rifle grenades, which is a new concept, to do 22mm NATO standard, you could attach that, and that has this wire. I'm not going to slide it in to kind of lock it in place. Keep in mind, this was before the combo device that we know and love for the FAL existed. In fact, you almost have to wonder if this whole system did not kind of inspire it. Because this way, you could set your gun up relatively quickly. This also has a wire to secure it Goes through and pins in like so, like that, and now it can't come off. Locked on. It's got a little play, but which probably isn't fantastic for accuracy, but it's not going anywhere. So there you kind of have all the accessories you might want, and we see all three of these devices folded into one with the later barrel style combo device that FN would introduce for the metric FAL. But I think it all started here, again with the short sights as well. Just trying to line this wire up here. That. I'm not sure how great the idea of using wires to secure things in the field was, but you know, early days, guys. Early days. They were still figuring things out. Now, some FALs were safe semi, like the L1A1. And some were made that way in service, like the Israeli Romat. But the G1, although I'm sure it was mostly only used in semi-automatic, single shot, was automatic, at least in theory. Now, this is a semi-automatic legal gun, YouTube. This is the safe position up here is normal, and this is the standard semi. Notice it's not a big throw, and with a very big throw that you're not really going to accidentally notice all the way forward is automatic. And again, the way the semi-automatics are done in America for FALs, you can have a 3-position selector. It will still just be semi-auto, even all the way forward. But that option was there on G1s, and as far as I know, was never disabled. But I have to question how often it was actually used in practice. It was probably an emergency defensive or positions being overrun measure, because between it being a 7.62 NATO gun and having a 20-round mag, you would run out of ammunition very quickly. So let's talk about some of the other parts on this here G1 and how they changed over time. So the reason I wanted to do a fresh video on this G1 is I've updated a bit. It has the wooden carry handle, which is original. Wood pistol grip, which this is actually a DS Arms replica because original wood grips are not all that common. And before, when you saw it, it had a Type C stock. Now it has a Type B without the ferrule. Interestingly, it does have the rotatable sling swivel, and it does have the trapdoor for a cleaning kit, where a lot of guns didn't. It was just, whatever the user wanted. And these are all early features that they shipped with originally, but they would often get replaced as parts would break and wear out, especially this handle. This was one of the first parts to get replaced, followed by the pistol grip. Type B, Type C stocks, you can see some repairs on this one. They hung around longer. This one also does have the metal cocking handle versus the later plastic. Those seem to get replaced quite often, because the Bundeswehr would use these, but really it was their second life where a lot of these parts got replaced. But yeah, they were delivered in 1957-58, 100,000. Now they'd evaluated the set meet, decided to go with this, and they wanted to stick with the G1. But the story is quite famous. The details are a little apocryphal, but long story short, Belgium, FN, would not grant production rights to West Germany. The exact back and forth is a little bit told in time, but they wouldn't. Yeah, can you blame them? They were happy to make all the guns they wanted for them, but yeah, they weren't going to let West Germany make them. So they had their 100,000 guns plus roughly 7,000 pre-G1s for the BGS. And that's what we basically have in West Germany. And that's not enough. Things are growing. The BGS is growing. The Bundeswehr is growing. The threat from the east is perceivably growing. The whole fold the gap thing. I mean, that's why we have the rifle grenade option here. And of course, already by 1958, this isn't working out for West Germany. And they're already looking at, well, you know what? No one really knows if West Germany not being able to manufacture the G1 was the deal breaker or just an excuse. Keep in mind, they had trialed out the Model 02 and the SETME Model A, and HK themselves had worked with SETME in Spain to make the Model B and subsequently the Model C. This is, of course, my Mars. We've looked at it quite recently. This is actually an early Model C, 1964 style. But the Model B, HK was working on it with them, and the idea was to make it more standard. It would be the first to be able to launch 22 millimeter NATO grenades. It was also the first they could fire 7.62 NATO. Now, with the Model B, adopted by Spain in 1958, you had to change out a few springs and parts to make it fire either the 7.62 SETME or the 7.62 NATO. So it wasn't perfect, but it was getting there. With the Model C, effectively it could fire both, although it was specifically designed for 7.62 NATO. So you have to wonder, since HK was working on it, if behind the scenes this wasn't really what they wanted in the first place. But in 1956, when they decided on the G1, this was meant to be the NATO standard round and rifle. Of course, 1957, the U.S. throws a monkey wrench and all that by adopting the M14. I don't know. A lot of things like that are lost to time. Long story short, after the initial batch of 100,000 in 1958, they were already doing trials again to replace the G1. Not because it was deficient, but simply because they couldn't build them. And was officially adopted as the Gewehr 3 in 1959, and production would be set up under license from Spain, and not only Heckler & Koch, but also Rheinmetall, so two companies. In fact, Rheinmetall would make these for about a decade. And I picked the SETME versus a standard like G3A3 because the early G3s used by the Bundeswehr were wood furniture, and they had a lot of early features, the sights, all that stuff. They would evolve quickly. By 1963-64, it was really the G3 we know and love. Well, some of us love. And it would become the standard. Now, this video is not on it. And you might ask, why did they go to this besides the politics? Is it a better gun than the FAL? Honestly, that's debatable and probably a subject for a whole other video, but they are very similar, even though no parts interchange. 20-round detaching mags, optional bipod on either one if you want. You've got a roughly 18-inch barrel on one, 21 on another. They obviously could have adopted later versions of the FAL if they wanted. Wood furniture originally. I will say the SETME was cheaper than the FAL, at least at the time. So there was that. And you might argue that the SETME is lighter. But it's also less serviceable and user-friendly. Like, you can keep an FAL running by replacing parts. I mean, they're built. A SETME, a G3, don't get me wrong, they're durable. They're absolutely durable. But stamped receiver, welded construction, just not as serviceable in the long run than the FAL. By the way, I haven't mentioned it yet. I haven't seen it. This is just a German mag pouch. It would have held two 20-round mags, either FAL or for the later G3. Leather, full top. Has the cool little pull tab like you see in some of their holsters. I think they're neat. Metric mags. They just use standard mags. I don't think these are even German, but most of them were just FN made. But it's a standard mag. So, what happened to the Bundeswehr's Gewehr 1s? Why I was restoring this gun. Not that it was wrong before, but it had the later style plastic handle. It had the plastic pistol grip, the Type C stock. And that's fine. Those parts got replaced in service. Heck, Forgotten Weapons and others have shown videos with a Type 2, which wasn't introduced until the early 60s, receiver. So, parts got replaced. But by the early 60s, the Bundeswehr was cycling these out, either to training or reserves, or just out entirely. So who was doing the replacing? Well, there were two main entities. One was Turkey, which is probably what you're more familiar with. They grabbed quite a few G1s from Germany, West Germany, and this was an ongoing tradition going back decades. Turkey, formerly the Ottoman Empire, had a lot of older German guns. Look at the 88 Commission rifle, a lot of your earlier Gewehr 98s. You'll see the little Turkish, before, again, Ottoman Moon, and even once they started doing their M38s, yeah, there's a lot of interplay there. And these can have some very interesting parts, including hand-carved stocks and pistol grips. In fact, take a look at one. Actually, it's not bad. I mean, it's got an interesting texture to it. The carving is certainly much cruder. And the sling cut out there. You can tell it's for the G1 because of the rotating there. And the hole. And where the tang fits up. It's not near as even. Inside it's not too bad. But no, I just thought it was kind of interesting. Plus, you know, Type C stock. But you could do a Turkish army build very easily, and it would be totally legitimate. So the Turks would absolutely replace parts, some officially, some from other guns that were scrapped for that, and some they made themselves. The Turkish guns tended to be pretty used, if not outright abused. So you can usually tell those kits. But they did come in with the original barrel. That's good, because the lug and system is pretty unique to this. By the way, this is not a standard lug on these. Even though it's the same basic shape as a regular like M1 style, it's located in a different position on the barrel, so they're not right interchangeable. Anyway, the problem is a lot of those came in during the assault weapons ban and were put together during the ban, so were effectively neutered one way or another. Sad, but what do you do about it? But there's another route, and if you notice, some G1 kits look pretty good. That's because the BGS also inherited quite a few. As I mentioned, they had about 7,000 of their pre-G1 guns, and they would seemingly get some of the G1 guns early on in the 50s too, but they would actually inherit more from the Bundeswehr in the 60s. How many? I don't know for sure, but I've seen rough numbers of maybe 30,000 FALs were in BGS service over the years. So figure, 20,000 or so former Bundeswehr guns would be transferred over. And these would not only be kept in good shape, they would be kept in service, at least in inventory, into the 1980s. And they were the ones that seemed to have replaced a lot of parts, including receivers, with factory FN. They would also sometimes replace with some domestic parts, like top covers. There are HK marked top covers and some other German-made parts. But I need to stress that Germany never made receivers, and they never made major components. So typically if you see German-made G1 components, they're just little bits and bobs. Otherwise you see mostly FN. That's why it's hard to say what's a correct G1 or even BGS, as we've talked about, because of the different contracts. This stuff got mixed and matched because they just kept their rifles rolling, and generally speaking, they're all the same pattern, same barrel length, same caliber, same magazine, even mostly the same furniture, because it was only the earliest couple of contracts that had alternative handguards. So, those are kind of the two sources. And yeah, the BGS really didn't retire theirs until almost the end of the Cold War period. So even though it wasn't all that successful in the Army, as it were, the Federal Army, the Border Guard seemed to hang on to it and like it. Now, was it because they preferred it over the G3, or is just kind of inherited? Who knows, but I like to think they had finer tastes. They were meant to be a smaller, more light unit, but at the same time, they had a very important charge of literally protecting the border up against East Germany and thus up against the Kampfblock, the Warsaw Pact. So that's why rifle grenade launching was so important, and why the G1 introduced that feature, whereas the previous BGS FALs just didn't have it. Of course, your SETMEs, G3s would have it, as we already mentioned. But yeah, I've had a lot of fun restoring this to something like how they would have been delivered with all wood and metal. There's really no polymer on these guns, but very, very quickly. In fact, it's often said that some of the very last G1s started to have some polymer parts. They probably also had Type C stocks, so you could make an argument there based on serials. But I was able to trade for this Type B stock, and it seems the correct type because it does have the trap door. And again, I like this DS Arms grip. Probably need to stain it to match the stock. And yeah, honestly, this carry handle, even though it's got a ding in it, pretty good shape. And I actually do have an FN top cover, but I kind of like keeping this on. But I'm pretty happy with it. But as I challenged at the beginning of the video, again, not you, Seth, can you pick out the one thing that's not quite right with this gun? Let me know in the comments. But no, I'm pretty happy with it. Of course, this is on a forged Type 1 DSA receiver. There were no pre-ban imports of these. There are a couple of registered machine guns in the country, but I don't do that. But it's a cool, interesting piece of history. The QD device is neat and pretty much unique to this exact model only. And the short sights really set the trend going forward. You know, we can play the what-if game with Spain and SETME and the G3. I honestly think, one way or the other, they were always going to adopt something like this. I think the FAL was a temporary appeasement to NATO and FN. By the way, they obviously had to pay FN for the G1. They weren't getting it for free. Other Allied nations, though, that helped liberate Belgium in World War II, like Great Britain, and the offer is extended to America too, of course, were offered the FAL pattern essentially at cost, including production license. For some reason, they didn't offer that to West Germany. According to Spain and Germany, they were different nations, right? And then you get to Austria. That was a sticky situation. Should they get the bonus points? Were they a victim or an aggressor in World War II? Yeah, as complicated as West Germany was in the early Cold War, Austria was more so. So next time we'll talk about the Sturmgewehr 1958 by Steyr, the STG-58, which was, frankly, directly based on this gun. But let me know what you think. Have you ever done a G1 build or a Bundeswehr? I almost have done a Bundeswehr, a BGS, a border guard build, but the difference is just we're never quite enough to warrant the investment in money and time. You know, money were no object, sure, absolutely, because it's a cool variation in and of itself. But since it is, I thought the G1 was a more historically important gun to focus on. But let me know what you think in the comments, if you agree or not. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support us, check out Patreon, and definitely check out the other FN, FAL, or SETME for that matter, videos. This is Misha. Catch you very soon, next time.